5 charts that show the rise of global militarization. In 2025, global military spending rose to $2.88 trillion. As countries spend more on their militaries, what does that mean for spending on healthcare and education? The world's militaries spent $2.88 trillion in 2025, an increase of 2.9% from the year before, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's SIPRI latest report. To put that number into perspective, $2.88 trillion amounts to $350 of military spending for each person on the planet. In this visual explainer, Al Jazeera unpacks the rise of global militarization, including how much each nation spends, which countries sell the most weapons, and how military spending compares with spending on healthcare and education. The U.S. again tops the list in military spending in 2025. The 5 biggest military spenders were the United States $954 billion, China $336 billion, Russia $190 billion, Germany $114 billion, and India $92 billion, accounting for more than half 58% of world military spending. The U.S. is by far the biggest spender, as it has been every year since World War II. The $954 billion spent by the U.S. is more than the next 6 countries combined. Since 1949, the U.S. has spent at least $53.5 trillion on its military, accounting for more than half 51.5% of the global total of more than $100 trillion. Military spending has generally followed the predictable pattern of rising during wartime and falling during more peaceful periods. The chart below shows the total global military spending over the past 75 years. Post-World War II, global military spending surged rapidly in the early 1950s, jumping from $284 billion in 1950 to $788 billion by 1953, largely reflecting the impact of the Korean War. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, spending stabilized at about $700–800 billion per year, indicating a sustained but controlled buildup during the early phase of the Cold War. Advertisement. This was followed by a sharp increase in the late 1960s, when spending crossed $1 trillion for the first time. This jump was driven largely by the Vietnam War and intensified superpower rivalry and arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which saw a peak of $1.7 trillion by 1988. The end of the Cold War saw military spending fall globally back down to $1.4 trillion by 1991. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks, U.S. military spending increased once more. Long U.S.-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq saw global spending exceed $2 trillion for the first time in 2009. In the past decade, global military spending has again been on the incline, with the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea marking an inflection point when NATO members set a target of spending 2% of their gross domestic product (GDP) on defense. Since 2016, military spending in Europe has doubled, with Eastern Europe seeing a 173% increase, the highest of any other sub-region in the world. And 2025 marks the highest levels of military spending in history, increasing to $2.88 trillion from $1.69 trillion in 2016, a rise of 41%. Which countries are arming most rapidly? Not all countries are arming at the same pace. A small group spends between $2,000 to $5,000 per capita, while most of the world remains below $100 to $500. In dollar terms per capita, Qatar spends the most on its military, growing from $1,231 per capita in 2006 to $5,428 by 2022, an increase of 340%. Israel follows, rising from $1,360 to $5,108 per capita, an increase of 276%. Norway is third, up 181% from $1,080 to $3,040. As a percentage, Ukraine shows the largest rise at 3,387% from $63 per capita in 2006 to $2,197 in 2025, reflecting its ongoing conflict with Russia. The chart below shows the 10 highest increases in spending over the past 20 years. Who sells most of the world's weapons? The trade of global arms is dominated by a select few countries, which often have strong military-industrial complexes. Between 2016 and 2025, $295 billion worth of weapons were sold worldwide. Other than spending the most on its own military, the U.S. is also the largest exporter of weapons in the world, making up 39% $115 billion of the total global share. A large part of Washington's dominance is driven by its foreign policy plans, the relationship between the defense industry and the government, and the level of innovation in the industry. Between 2020 and 2024, private firms received $2.4 trillion in Pentagon contracts, more than half of the department's discretionary spending, according to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and Costs of War at Brown University's Watson School of International and Public Affairs last year. A third $771 billion of those contracts went to just 5 companies: Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman. Advertisement: the second largest arms exporter is Russia, accounting for 13% $40 billion of global share, followed by France, 9.3% $28 billion, followed by China, 5.5% $16 billion, and Germany, 5.5% $16 billion. How does military spending compare with healthcare and education? When a country is asked to spend more on defense, that money has to come from somewhere. Unless governments expand their budgets or raise new revenue, increased military spending can strain other sectors that people rely on every day, like healthcare and education. Across 137 countries analyzed by Al Jazeera, we classified each country by which sector it spends most on as a function of GDP: healthcare, education, or the military. 114 countries spend the most on healthcare, 14 countries spend the most on education, 9 countries spend the most on the military. The table below highlights these results. Click on